Hello and thank you for joining. I'm Dr. Rebecca Hood and I'm Nanotemper's product manager for Prometheus. Today I'll be discussing how the Prometheus Panta provides multi-parameter stability characterization that helps you optimize your biologics buffer conditions. Specifically, I'll be going over why buffer optimization is such a key step in the biologics development workflow and some considerations for planning these sorts of experiments. After that, we'll look at buffer screening data to see how different variables affect monoclonal antibody stability and how the Panta provides high-resolution data to better characterize these changes in stability. First, let's talk about why buffer formulation is so important. Having the right buffer for biologics is vital to success. Now, during development, you'll typically be working with a simple buffer that maintains pH and solubility, which is sufficient for initial screening. And usually this is something widely accessible like a phosphate buffered saline or PBS at pH 7.4. Now, however, this buffer is probably not going to be ideal for the stressors associated with scale-up, manufacturing, and distribution. Some factors to be mindful of include temperature, both manufacturing temperature and long-term storage temperature, how the antibody will be stored, the cost and availability of the buffer components, sensitivity of the antibody and buffer to light exposure and oxidation, and factors that may affect administration. Now, that's a lot of different conditions to be mindful of, and there are a lot of variables when considering the impact of buffer formulation on stability, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The goal of pre-formulation studies is to start to narrow down which buffer conditions are the most stabilizing. Now, we know that there are a few characteristics that stabilizing buffers tend to have in common. And these requirements were actually identified back in a paper in 1972, published by Good and Asawa. We've gained a lot more knowledge about other buffer components since then, but these characteristics still hold true. First, the components should be soluble in water. Second, they should be relatively impermeable across cell membranes. Third, they should have a consistent acid-base dissociation constant. Fourth, we want a low metal chelating capability to avoid interfering with metal ions at active sites. Fifth, high chemical stability, which makes sense when we're trying to optimize stability. And finally, low absorption spectra in the UV-Vis regions. Now, most biologic buffers are going to have these characteristics, but this is just something to keep in mind. And even if buffers fit these criteria, there are other characteristics that will have an impact on protein stability. The first of these is pH. Now, if the pH of your buffer is too close to the protein's isoelectric point, the protein will have no net charge and be more prone to aggregation. Next, salts have a significant impact on the solubility of proteins in solution. With no salt, charged side chains or termini tend to attract each other, which can lead to aggregation. Third, the conductivity of a buffer will impact purification. And we know that ion exchange chromatography needs consistent conductivity, so it's just important to be mindful of this. And last, excipients such as surfactants, metal chelates, and adjuvants can enhance stability to keep monoclonal antibodies intact during transportation and long-term storage. By now, I think it's becoming apparent that having a large number of variables is a consistent theme in buffer optimization, which is going to make buffer selection a challenge. With so many buffers to screen, you'll need selection approaches that are fast and scalable. And you'll also need a reliable way to assess these conditions while ensuring that the presence of excipients doesn't interfere with the data. And I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, but some excipients can interact with external dyes that are used in certain types of experiments, which can result in difficult to interpret data output. It's also important to be mindful of how much material is available to test. Now, before scaling up, you may not have enough material to be able to perform lots of different stability screens using multiple instruments. And there's also concentration to consider. Are the buffers going to be diluted? Being mindful of this when designing screens can help you to identify if you'll need to assess predictive metrics in your experiments. And finally, when comparing a lot of data generated from screening many different conditions, you'll need to develop a process to identify those optimal conditions. And it can help to define cutoff criteria to define which values are or are not acceptable for different parameters. And it also helps to have multiple selection criteria so you get a more complete picture of how your buffer components are affecting the stability of your biologic. Now, I've been talking about buffer formulations in general terms, but before we get into the data, I'd just like to go over some terminology and where these types of experiments fit in the biologics development workflow. Pre-formulation and formulation mean different things and have different objectives depending on where you are in the development process and your group's goals. We know that buffer optimization occurs at several different points in development, and these can be split into pre-formulation, formulation, and process development. For this webinar, I'll be focusing on pre-formulation buffer selection and optimization. So we'd be talking about experiments that would typically be done earlier in development to provide information that guides final formulation experiments. Now, these types of experiments are generally done before scale-up, but after an optimal candidate has already been selected from a library or screen. So you'll be optimizing around the ideal conditions for that particular candidate. Now, it's important to note that while you'll be able to assess the stability of your candidate in the optimized buffer using the techniques I'll discuss in a bit, you'll still need to retest the activity of your candidate to ensure that there's no loss of efficacy or function. And it's also important to remember that there are other stressors to consider for optimization, such as the effects of freeze-thaw cycles and packaging. So these should all be taken into account when selecting the most stabilizing buffer conditions. However, having both conformational and colloidal stability data gives you a lot of information about your buffer candidates and can really help to narrow down the number of formulations in consideration, especially at the early workflow pre-formulation stage. So while we'll be focusing on pre-formulation studies today, I'd just like to point out some variables to consider when transitioning from upstream pre-formulation experiments to final formulation and manufacturing conditions, as these can help to guide those initial studies. So first, buffers prepared in bulk are generally described by weight instead of volume. So it's important to consider buffer density and the viscosity of your solutions when adjusting. Now, second, adjusting the pH with hydrochloric acid or sodium hydroxide isn't acceptable for large-scale manufacture, so it's best to combine an acid with its conjugate base, or vice versa. So the cost of component materials may make it unreasonable to use a buffer for a final formulation. So for example, using a Heaps buffer to equilibrate an affinity column will cost over 7 times more than just using a phosphate buffer. So it just makes sense to be mindful of cost as you consider different types of buffer components. And lastly, you'll need to ensure that the component materials are available at a quality that's sufficient to pass QC requirements and ensure the reproducibility of your product. So as you can see, there are a lot of variables that go into identifying an optimal buffer formulation, which means you'll end up having a lot of different conditions to screen. Now, fortunately, we have a biophysical tool that makes the screening and selection of optimal candidates a little bit easier. And that's the Prometheus Panta. So the Prometheus Panta is an easy-to-use instrument that gives you high-resolution data about your formulations while using a minimal amount of sample. So among the benefits, the Panta provides precise measurements that give you high-resolution data so you can detect subtle differences between your buffer formulations. You get label-free detection, which gives you flexibility in the types of buffers and excipients you can use and prevents any dye artifacts. The Panta accommodates a broad range of sample concentrations, which means that you can get the data you need about your buffers without needing highly concentrated samples. And with low sample consumption, you get multiple stability characteristics about your buffer formulations with just a small amount of sample. Now, the way the Panta is able to do this is by combining 4 different technologies that take measurements simultaneously across a single thermal ramp. So the first of these technologies is nano-DSF, which uses your sample's intrinsic fluorescence to assess thermal stability. And next we have DLS, which is used to check the purity of your sample and measure aggregation. A third is back reflection, which provides turbidity information that can help to tell you if you have large aggregates forming in your sample. And finally, we have SLS, which resolves small changes in size and detects small aggregates. Now, I won't be going into the details of how these technologies work together in this talk, but if you're interested, you can learn more from the Explore the Prometheus Panta video. So there are a lot of parameters that are directly measurable by the Panta, and several more can be derived from the data. And the ones I'll be focusing on today are highlighted here. And these will provide stability characteristics that were measured by analyzing antibodies in different types of buffers with the Prometheus Panta to assess melting temperature, T size, and T ag. So let's take a look at some of the stability parameters that are measurable with the Prometheus Panta. And so for this example, we'll be looking at data from bermekimab, which is a monoclonal antibody that's currently being investigated for the treatment of systemic sclerosis. Now, one way to compare the stability of your biologics in different buffers is by looking at the thermal stability, and nano-DSF provides an easy way to do so. So by using the intrinsic fluorescence of a molecule, nano-DSF is a label-free methodology that measures how a biologic unfolds across a thermal denaturation gradient. By doing so, we derive the melting temperatures, or TMs, associated with different domains in your biologic and compare these across buffer conditions. Now, the higher the TM, the more thermal stability is conferred by the buffer. So at the top of this figure, we see the change in the ratio of light emitted at 350 and 330 nanometers, and how it changes across the thermal ramp as the previously folded internalized amino acids become exposed to the solvent. Now at the bottom of this figure, we see the first derivative view of this data, which makes it a little bit easier to visualize key transitions by looking at the peaks. And so the two peaks you see here reflect the inflection points, where half of the domain is folded and half is unfolded. And this represents the two melting temperatures for the different bermekimab domains. So just from this data, we're already starting to see how nano-DSF gives important stability information about bermekimab. And just to be clear, this experiment was run with proteins at 1 mg per mil, and the thermal ramp was 1 degree Celsius per minute. And this was the ramp rate that was used for all of the data we'll be looking at later in this presentation. So I mentioned that the Prometheus Panta has 4 different types of optics, and this allows us to get multiple stability characteristics in a single thermal ramp. So the data at the top is the conformational data we just looked at, and underneath is colloidal stability data obtained from back reflection and light scattering measurements. So keep in mind, this is all collected in parallel in the same experiment. And so with this data, you see at what temperature your antibodies start to unfold and aggregate, leading to an increase in turbidity, the measured cumulant radius, and scattering. So together, these give a more detailed picture of protein stability by describing multiple stability parameters. Now, if we take these measurements for bermekimab in different buffer formulations, it's possible to compare across conditions and begin to identify which buffer conditions cause the protein to be more or less stable. And as I mentioned before, the really nice thing about the Panta is that you get these stability measurements across the entire thermal ramp. So you can pinpoint when changes to your protein, like melting and aggregation, start to occur. It's also beneficial because you get all of these stability parameters from a single experiment, which saves you time and sample. Now let's look at how the screening data looks in practice. So for this, we're using antibodies that target different epitopes of RAP. Now, unlike bermekimab, this antibody hasn't been optimized for clinical use, so it's a slightly more realistic representation of what this process looks like. So here's buffer screening data from our first RAC antibody. Now, I know this is a lot of data, but this is just to show you how much data you can get and quickly for your formulation screens. Now, I wanted to show this to demonstrate that when you've got a lot of conditions to screen, it's possible to do with the Panta. Now, this data, which measures 3 related antibodies in 24 different buffer conditions and includes replicates, can be collected in a single day. And this obviously results in a lot of data to sort through. Now, I won't be going into the Panta's analysis software here, and that's actually going to be the focus of an upcoming webinar. But the analysis software does make it easy to get values for actionable stability metrics. And the data resolution in the Panta helps make this a little bit more manageable too, since the precise measurements mean you don't have to run as many replicates to get data that you feel confident in. Okay, so let's look at something where it's a little bit easier to see differences between the conditions. So this is a subset of the data that I just showed, but now we're looking at how a single variable affects antibody stability. So this is data from our first anti-RAC antibody, which I'll just refer to as antibody number 1. So here we're looking at how the pH of the buffer affects stability. And for simplicity, we're just starting with the conformational stability data. You can already start to see that some buffers are destabilizing. So remember that the higher the TM, the more stabilizing a buffer is. So this visual comparison is easier to do in the first derivative view, where it's easier to see here that the buffer with pH 4 is clearly destabilizing. Now pH 5 is a little bit better, and the remaining ones are fairly comparable. And thanks to the data resolution from the Panta, we can still detect differences in TMs between the different buffer pHs, which means that we can start to rank the most optimal buffer conditions. But we know there's more to stability than just the conformational stability, so let's add a little more dimension to this. So as we saw before, the conformational stability is at the top of this figure and the colloidal stability is at the bottom. This is the same screen we were looking at on the previous slide, but now we've got additional parameters to better understand how pH affects our anti-RAC antibody stability. So looking at the colloidal stability data, we can see how the different pHs affect aggregation and protein size, with aggregation occurring slightly quicker or slower depending on the pH. Now again, these are subtle differences, but they're still really helpful when you're screening lots of conditions and need to narrow down your formulation options. Now we'll see some values for these measures on the next slide, but while we're looking at the colloidal stability data, I'd just like to point out T-size and T-ag. So both of these are derived from 2 different sources of data. So T-size describes when the radius of the protein, which is measured from DLS data, starts to increase, which means that the protein has started to unfold. Now, T-ag is derived from the back reflection data and describes when aggregation starts to occur. Now, both of these are helpful parameters to consider when evaluating colloidal stability. So depending on the data, it may be necessary to balance all of these different parameters to find the optimal solution. Or to put it another way, it might be worth selecting a buffer with slightly lower conformational stability to get an improvement in colloidal stability. But the nice thing is you get all of these parameters in a single experiment, which makes it easy to get the data you need to identify optimal formulations. So we've been looking at plots of the data, but now let's look at what the values actually are. So here are the melting temperatures and the buffer pHs that were most stabilizing. And we saw that the lower pH buffers had a lower conformational stability. But if we look at our colloidal stability parameters, T size and T ag are actually higher on the buffers with lower pH. So the lower the lower pH buffers confer more colloidal stability. So we're starting to see how we need to consider both conformational and colloidal stability measures in order to optimize the formulation buffer. Now, it's also important to consider the final usage or downstream applications to identify if there are certain parameters that should be prioritized. So for this example, the buffer with pH 7 was chosen to have a neutral pH for downstream cell culture applications. So now that we've chosen the optimal pH, let's look at how the buffer itself affects stability. So here we're looking at that anti-RAC antibody number 1 and sodium phosphate buffer, and that's the dark blue, and then in PBS, and that's that light blue line. So both of these are the same pH, but we see that there are some subtle differences between the two conditions, with the sodium phosphate buffer being slightly more stable. And you can really see that here and here. So as I mentioned before, these differences are small, but they still indicate which conditions are more likely to contribute to an optimal buffer formulation, depending on your downstream applications. Okay, so we know that salts can help to stabilize proteins in solution, but obviously you need to identify at which concentration the stabilization occurs. So here we're looking at antibody number 1 again, this time in PBS with different sodium chloride concentrations. So the highest salt concentration is doing some weird things to the colloidal stability, and you can start to see that here. But in general, the lower salt concentrations aren't having much of an impact on the stability. And this is just another example of how the Panta makes it easy to perform screens to see how excipients affect multiple stability characteristics, and helps you to optimize the concentration of those excipients. So I've talked about how important precision is in screening, so let's be precise in looking at the effect of sodium chloride on the stability of antibody number 1. Now, we didn't see much of an effect with the lower concentrations of sodium chloride, but if we look at the higher concentrations, there's a negative impact on colloidal stability. Now, sodium chloride can help to alleviate viscosity issues, so this is actually helpful information to know if the final concentration of the antibody is intended to be higher than what we're measuring here. So again, it's just helpful to be mindful of downstream applications to provide more context to these types of results. Okay. So sodium chloride didn't have much of an effect, but let's look at other excipients. So the data here shows our antibody number 1 and PBS with different excipients in each condition. Now there's a lot of conditions shown here, but it's still obvious that some excipients are destabilizing, while others improve colloidal stability relative to PBS alone. And while we don't have time to go into this, I'd hope it's apparent by now that it's easy to continue these screening studies to optimize the concentrations of the excipients in your buffer formulation. So this is the same data, but now we're just looking at the best and worst of the tested excipients. So as you might expect, adding 1 millimolar of TSEP is destabilizing, and we can easily see how much that shifted the curves. However, 5% glycerol is stabilizing relative to PBS, which is really helpful to know if you're considering the long-term stability for storage or freezing. Now, it's not a huge shift, but it does make a difference when you need to triage things for large buffer scrapes. Now, zooming back out to look at these values from all of the excipients we tested, let's look at the error we see in these measurements. So if we look at glycerol and PEG, the stabilizing excipients reduce error in the light scattering measurements. And this is a good sign that they're enhancing the stability and consistency of the antibody. And we also see that a small amount of tween helps reduce small aggregate formation and improves colloidal stability. Now, if we look at DMSO and TSEP, they destabilize the antibody and increase the amount of error from our scattering measurements. Now, this isn't surprising given the nature of these molecules, but it's important to remember that downstream assays may require the use of these bad excipients, so it's necessary to monitor how they're impacting stability. Now, unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to working with antibody formulations. So here we're comparing the stability of antibody number 1 with another antibody, which has the same base but targets a different RAC epitope. Now, to continue with the naming convention, I'll just refer to this as antibody number 2. So as you see, even in the same buffer, there are significant differences between the conformational and colloidal stability of these two antibodies. So even though the differences between these two antibodies are just in the variable region, we still see very different stability profiles. Now, this is just an example to serve as a reminder that the results from screens to optimize buffer formulations are very specific, and you'll need to tailor the formulation to each antibody. Now, to further emphasize that point, let's look at how the two anti-RAC antibodies behave in the presence of tween. Now, antibody number 1 is in the darker colors, and antibody number 2 is in the lighter colors. Now, there isn't much of a change in the conformational stability with tween, but if we look at colloidal stability, we see that while tween doesn't have much of an effect on antibody 1, it does affect antibody 2. And I hope I've convinced you by now, but if I haven't, this is a really good example of why it's important to assess both conformational and colloidal stability when evaluating buffer formulations. And for our last data example, let's look at those changes in colloidal stability in a little bit more detail. Now we're just looking at antibody number 2. So tween improves the colloidal stability of this antibody, which we can see with the shift in T-ag. And this makes sense since tween is a surfactant. So here we know it's acting to reduce this antibody's propensity to self-aggregate, and we can see this here with that shift. So I hope that in walking through this data, I've demonstrated how the Prometheus Panta is valuable for optimizing buffer formulations. So first, the sensitivity of the measurements means that even small, subtle changes are apparent, so you don't miss any important differences between conditions. Reproducible data means increased confidence in your results and the need to run fewer replicates. The Panta requires a low sample volume and runs all these experiments in parallel, so you aren't having to use a lot of sample to get multiple stability parameters. And because of the Panta's technology, you don't need any extrinsic dye, giving you flexibility with buffer conditions and preventing dye artifacts. Now, the Panta only requires light maintenance, so you'll be able to continue running these screening experiments without the need for a lot of downtime for maintenance or repairs. And the Panta is flexible with throughput and allows for scalability should your throughput needs change in the future. Now, I've talked a lot about why the Panta is well suited for these experiments, but I'd also like to say that Nanotemper itself is committed to making sure your experiments are successful. So we have extensive resources online, and this includes lots of protocols, guides, videos, and instructions. Plus, we have an application support team who's available to help you with these types of experiments. And we have ongoing support, which includes trainings and user meetings, so you can learn more about what the Panta can do and see what sort of data other people are generating from it. So to wrap up, the Prometheus Panta is engineered to give you the stability characteristics you need to confidently identify the most stable buffer formulations for your biologics. And with that, I would like to thank everybody for listening today. I'd especially like to thank Dr. Andreas Langer. He ran all of the experiments that provided the data I showed throughout the webinar, so it was super helpful. Thank you.